In the deepest quiet of a fading world, just when Europe seemed swallowed by darkness, a silent spark began to rise. A spark that would change the course of human history forever. Europe had lived for centuries under a heavy weight. War, plague, hunger, all had dimmed the spirit of a continent that once shone brightly. But beneath all that silence, something small, almost invisible, began to move. In forgotten libraries, in cold stone monasteries, in the quiet corners of busy markets, whispers of new ideas slowly returned. Scholars brushed dust off ancient manuscripts. Young minds gathered around soft candlelight, searching for meaning, beauty, and knowledge. Hope was fragile, but it was growing. Almost without anyone noticing, Europe began to open its eyes again. A gentle shift, a quiet awakening, a feeling that the world did not have to remain dark. A new light was rising, soft at first, but destined to reshape everything. This was the first breath of the Renaissance. For generations, Europe had clung to survival, but knowledge had never truly died. Even in the darkest centuries, monks copied ancient texts by hand, slowly, carefully, preserving the wisdom of long-lost worlds. In quiet rooms lit only by a single flame, they saved the writings of Plato, Aristotle, and countless forgotten thinkers. Each page they copied was a seed waiting for the right moment to grow. And far beyond Europe, another force was at work. In the libraries of the Islamic world, in Baghdad, Cairo, Cordoba, scholars translated Greek science and philosophy, expanding it, questioning it, keeping it alive when Europe could not. These ideas began to drift back westward through merchants, travelers, and dusty manuscripts. They crossed seas, mountains, and kingdoms, carrying the knowledge Europe had lost back to the place where it was born. Slowly, the continent began to remember, not through war, not through conquest, but through learning. And from these fragile memories, a quiet promise formed: the world could become bright again. For centuries, Europe had slept in uncertainty, but slowly the world began to open its eyes. Cities that once felt quiet and dim started to breathe again. Trade roads grew busy, harbors filled with sails, and voices returned to the marketplaces. With every exchange, spices, silk, stories, discoveries, new ideas slipped into Europe like gentle sparks in the night. Travelers brought maps of unfamiliar lands, engineers carried drawings of strange machines, and scholars returned with books filled with wonders that Europe had never seen. Florence, Venice, and Milan became gathering places for dreamers, artists, thinkers, inventors, all searching for something brighter than the world they had inherited. Workshops glowed late into the night, filled with whispers, charcoal sketches, and the soft scrape of tools shaping wood and stone. And through this quiet movement, a new feeling began to spread. The world was changing, not through fate or fear, but through imagination. Europe was waking, slowly, gently, and the first light of the Renaissance was beginning to shine. As Europe slowly awakened, something quiet, almost invisible, began to move beneath the surface of daily life. Not armies, not kings, but ideas, soft, patient, and powerful. In small rooms lit by oil lamps, scholars gathered around ancient manuscripts that had slept for centuries. Texts from Greece and Rome, forgotten during the long, dark years, were read again with wonder and disbelief. The words spoke of balance, of beauty, of human dignity. They whispered that the world was not only a place of suffering, but a place where the mind could fly. And those whispers spread. Teachers began questioning old beliefs. Students traveled far from home to learn from the brightest minds. Wandering philosophers carried new thoughts from one city to another, ideas that glowed like lanterns in a fog-covered night. Workshops, libraries, taverns, and small chapels became places of curiosity. People debated quietly, their voices soft, as if afraid that speaking too loudly might break the fragile magic of discovery. This was the silent revolution. not fought with swords, but with inspiration. And in that gentle shift, Europe found the courage to dream again. As ideas quietly reshaped the mind, something else began to change the heart. Art was no longer just decoration, it became a mirror. Painters stopped drawing symbols alone and started studying the human face, the curve of a smile, the weight of sorrow in tired eyes, the calm of a soul at rest. Bodies were painted with balance and grace, not to glorify heaven, but to honor humanity itself. Sculptors returned to marble as if speaking to the stone. They carved movement into stillness, emotion into silence. Each statue felt alive, as though it might breathe if watched long enough. In workshops filled with soft hammer taps and the smell of oil and dust, artists observed the world carefully. Light, shadow, proportion. They learned that beauty followed rules, but rules discovered, not imposed. Churches still stood tall, but now their walls told new stories. Stories where humans were not small and broken, but thoughtful, curious, and strong. And for the first time in generations, people did not just pray inside these spaces, they wandered. Art became a quiet teacher, a gentle guide, a reminder that life itself could be studied, understood, and deeply felt. The Renaissance was no longer only an idea. It had found a face. As art awakened emotion, another force began to stir quietly in the background. Curiosity. People started asking questions they had not dared to ask for centuries. Why do the stars move the way they do? How does the human body truly work? What laws guide nature when no one is watching? Scholars opened ancient texts long forgotten. Greek, Roman, Arabic knowledge preserved through time. They didn't read to obey. They read to understand. In dimly lit rooms, by candlelight, men sketched bones, measured shadows, and traced the paths of planets. Observation replaced blind belief. Experience began to matter more than tradition. Leonardo da Vinci filled pages with quiet questions, studying muscles, water currents, and the flight of birds as if nature itself were a book waiting to be read. Astronomers looked upward and felt something unsettling. The heavens were no longer distant and perfect. They were patterns, movements, systems, and with every discovery, a gentle shift occurred. Knowledge was no longer owned by the past. It was being rebuilt, slowly, patiently, by human hands and human thought. This curiosity did not shout. It whispered, but its whisper traveled far. Because once people realized the world could be questioned, it could never return to silence again. While curiosity reshaped thought, power quietly reshaped the world, not through swords, but through gold. Across Italy, wealthy families rose to bankers, merchants, dynasties built on trade and finance. Florence stood at the center of it all, a city humming with coins, contracts, and ambition. The Medici family did not rule with crowns. They ruled with influence, loans, favors, patronage. Artists no longer painted only for churches. They painted for patrons, men and women who wanted beauty, legacy, and remembrance. A sculpture was no longer just devotion. It became identity, a message carved in stone. We were here. Painters were given time, space, freedom to experiment. Workshops became laboratories of ideas passed from master to apprentice like quiet inheritance. Wealth fueled creation. Creation fueled prestige. Prestige fueled more wealth. And slowly, art began to reflect human desire, not just divine perfection. Faces showed emotion. Bodies showed movement. Scenes showed life as it truly felt. Power, once measured by armies, was now measured by culture. And without realizing it, Europe began to change not because it was forced, but because it was inspired. The Renaissance was no longer a thought, it was a system, supported, funded, protected, and it was just beginning to spread. At first, the Renaissance belonged to Italy, its cities, its patrons. It's artists. But ideas are not meant to stay still. They travel quietly, with merchants, with students, with books tucked beneath cloaks. Printing presses began to hum across Europe. Ink met paper, and knowledge multiplied. A single idea once whispered in Florence could now reach Paris, London, and beyond. Northern Europe received the Renaissance differently. Art turned in more detailed, more intimate. Painters focused on everyday life. Simple rooms, quiet labor, human moments frozen in time. Education expanded. Universities grew restless. Students questioned old authorities with new confidence. Humanism crossed borders. The belief that human reason mattered, that learning was not rebellion, but responsibility. And with every border crossed, the Renaissance changed shape. It adapted, it blended, it evolved. No longer a single movement, it became a conversation. Europe was no longer thinking alone. It was thinking together. And once ideas began moving freely, there was no force strong enough to contain them again. As ideas traveled across Europe, they began to touch something deeply rooted: faith. For centuries, belief had been absolute, unquestioned, unmoving. But now, questions crept into quiet minds. Scholars returned to original texts, not translations, but the earliest words themselves. They compared, they analyzed, they noticed contradictions. The church remained powerful, yet its certainty began to soften at the edges. Some wondered, was faith meant to silence thought or guide it? Artists painted sacred scenes with human emotion. Saints wept, angels hesitated. Christ appeared fragile and real. Religion was no longer distant. It stood closer to human experience. Priests debated in candlelit halls. Theologians argued gently, then passionately. Printing presses spread sermons, critiques, and forbidden questions. Most people still believed, but belief was changing. It became personal, internal, reflective. Faith was no longer just inherited, it was explored. And in that exploration, Europe took a quiet step towards something new. Not the loss of belief, but the beginning of choice. A choice that would soon reshape the church itself and fracture the world that once stood united. As belief shifted, so did learning. Education quietly stepped out of monasteries and into the wider world. For centuries, Latin had ruled knowledge, sacred, untouchable. But now something new appeared: learning in one's own language. Books were written for people, not just scholars. Merchants studied mathematics. Artists learned anatomy and perspective. Schools began teaching more than obedience. They taught curiosity, logic, rhetoric. Humanist teachers believed education should shape character, not just memory. Language itself became a tool of thought. Ideas felt closer, clearer, more alive. Universities expanded their subjects: history, poetry, science, philosophy. Students debated ideas openly, respectfully, boldly. And for the first time, knowledge felt personal, not distant, not reserved. It belonged to anyone willing to learn. This quiet transformation created a new kind of mind, one that questioned without fear, studied without limits, and imagined without restraint. The Renaissance was no longer confined to art or science. It lived in classrooms, in language, in thought itself. And once minds were awakened, the future could no longer remain the same. As education expanded, something subtle began to rise: the individual. For centuries, identity had been fixed by birth, by class, by tradition. But now people began to see themselves differently. Artists signed their names, writers spoke in their own voice, thinkers explored personal experience as something meaningful. Life was no longer only about one's place in the divine order. It was also about personal potential. Portraits changed. Faces were no longer idealized. They were specific, human, unique. People wanted to be remembered not just as servants of God, but as themselves. Autobiographies appeared, letters filled with private thoughts, diaries captured quiet reflection. Success became tied to effort, talent, learning. A new belief formed that a person could shape their own future. This idea was gentle but powerful. It encouraged ambition, creativity, responsibility. The Renaissance was teaching Europe that a single human life mattered. And once that belief took root, society itself began to change. Because when people see themselves as individuals, they begin to imagine new paths for the world around them. As people began to understand themselves, they turned outward, toward the world beyond familiar horizons. Curiosity no longer stayed within books. It stepped onto ships, into laboratories, across unknown seas. Maps were redrawn. Blank spaces invited questions. The world felt larger and smaller at the same time. Sailors followed stars with new precision. Instruments measured distance and direction. The ocean became a path, not a barrier. Back on land, science moved quietly forward. Anatomists studied the human body with careful hands and patient eyes. They observed rather than assumed, measured rather than repeat. Nature became something to examine, not fear. Plants were classified, animals were studied, patterns were recorded. The universe itself felt closer. Astronomers charted movements, noticing order where chaos was once believed to reign. Each discovery softened old boundaries, between known and between myth and truth, between belief and evidence. The Renaissance was expanding the world, not by conquering it, but by understanding it. And with every horizon crossed, human confidence grew quietly stronger. The future was no longer imagined, it was being explored. As new ideas spread, they did not arrive without resistance. The old world did not disappear quietly. Tradition pushed back. Authority tightened its grip. Questions were met with suspicion. Some thinkers were warned to stay silent. Others were watched. A few were punished for thinking too freely. The Renaissance moved forward, but not without tension. In classrooms, teachers debated what could be taught. In churches, priests argued over what could be said. Families disagreed across generations. Fathers trusted the old ways. Sons dreamed of something different. The new world felt exciting, but also dangerous. Ideas had consequences now. Words carried weight. Curiosity could inspire or threaten. Some chose caution, others chose courage. And slowly, society learned to live between two worlds, one rooted in tradition, the other reaching toward change. This struggle shaped the Renaissance as much as art or science ever did, because progress was not smooth. It was negotiated, debated, earned. And in that quiet conflict, Europe learned a powerful lesson. Change does not erase the past, it challenges it. As Europe awakened, it paid a quiet price. Not every discovery felt safe. For some, the Renaissance brought up, for others, uncertainty. Old professions faded. New skills were demanded. Those who could not adapt were left behind. Knowledge empowered some, but frightened others. Authority weakened in places where it had once been absolute. This created freedom and anxiety. Wars were fought not only with weapons but with ideas. Beliefs, worldviews collided. Even progress carried weight. Artists struggled with expectation. Scholars feared being misunderstood. Thinkers walked carefully between truth and survival. And yet, despite the cost, the movement did not stop, because once awareness begins, it cannot be undone. The Renaissance taught Europe that growth requires sacrifice, comfort, certainty, and sometimes peace. But it also revealed something deeper, that humanity was willing to endure uncertainty for the sake of understanding. And in that willingness, a new future quietly took shape. In the quiet aftermath of a great awakening, Europe found itself standing at the edge of a new world. But what mysteries lay beyond this transformation? And how would the future unfold from these silent echoes? As the Renaissance settled into history, its echoes remained. Europe was no longer the same land it once had been. People thought differently, questioned differently, imagined differently. The world felt open, not because every answer was known, but because asking was now allowed. Art carried emotion. Science carried curiosity. Education carried possibility. The individual had found a voice, and with it, a sense of responsibility. The Renaissance did not. It faded into the fabric of everyday life, into how people learned, how they believed, how they understood themselves. It became the foundation of the modern world, quiet, enduring, unavoidable. And as generations passed, the movement lived on, not in grand moments, but in simple acts of thought. A question asked, a book opened, a mind awakened. The Renaissance was not just a rebirth of art, it was a reminder that even after long darkness, human curiosity endures. And as this story gently comes to rest, the world it shaped continues to breathe through every thought that dares to wonder. After the Renaissance reshaped thought, its effects did not arrive all quietly, almost unnoticed. Cities changed first. Streets filled with new buildings, libraries expanded, workshops multiplied, but deeper changes happened inside people. Children grew up learning to question. Merchants calculated risk and reward. Artists imagined beyond tradition. Old certainties weakened. New possibilities appeared. This created tension between comfort and curiosity, between obedience and choice. Some longed for the stability of the past, others embraced uncertainty. The Renaissance did not promise safety, it offered awareness. And awareness came with responsibility. People were no longer guided only by tradition. They were guided by thought, by observation, by reason. This shift was gentle but irreversible, because once a society learns to think for itself, it can never fully return to what it was before. As time passed, the Renaissance stopped feeling new. It became normal norm. People no longer spoke of awakening, they simply lived within it. Ideas that once felt dangerous became part of everyday thought. Questioning was no longer rebellion, it was habit. Cities adjusted to this quiet transformation, universities settled into routine, workshops followed new standards, books filled shelves across generations. The extraordinary slowly became ordinary, but beneath that calm surface, something powerful remained, a different way of seeing the world. Nature was no longer mysterious by default. It was something to be studied. Authority was no longer absolute by nature. It could be examined. Truth was no longer inherited blindly. It was explored patiently. This created a subtle confidence. Not loud, not proud, but steady. People trusted their own minds a little more each day, and that trust shaped the future more than any single invention ever could. The Renaissance no longer announced itself. It whispered through daily life, and in those whispers, the world continued to change without ever needing to look back. As generations passed, the Renaissance no longer felt like a movement. It felt like the natural state of the world. Children were born into it. They did not remember the old silence. They only knew a world where learning was possible. Books were no longer rare wonders. They were familiar companions. Ideas traveled faster than people. Thought crossed borders without passports, and slowly Europe adjusted. Time itself felt different. The future was no longer something feared. It was something imagined. People planned, designed, dreamed ahead. The past still mattered, but it no longer ruled. Tradition became a reference, not a chain. This change was quiet, almost invisible. No celebrations marked it, no bells rang. But the world had shifted beneath everyone's feet. The Renaissance had taught Europe to live forward. And once a civilization learns to imagine its future, it can never fully return to the past again. As the world moved forward, people began to notice what had been left behind. Not everything survived the change. Some traditions faded quietly. Old beliefs softened, then disappeared. Guilds lost their control. Feudal bonds weakened. The rigid order of society began to loosen. With new freedom came uncertainty. Not everyone benefited equally. Some felt lost in the new world. Others struggled to find their place. Cities grew larger, faster, more crowded, life became more complex. More choices meant more responsibility. More opportunity meant more risk. And yet, despite the confusion, few wished to return, because even uncertainty felt lighter than blind obedience. The Renaissance had given people something irreversible: awareness, an understanding that the world could change and that humans could change with it. This realization lingered quietly, shaping laws, economies, and future revolutions. The Renaissance was no longer present, but it was no longer gone either. It had become part of the human story. As the Renaissance settled into everyday life, people stopped asking when it began. Instead, they started wondering what it had set in motion, because, beneath the calm surface, something was still unfolding. New ideas no longer shocked society, they quietly prepared it. Governments began to change how they ruled. Laws were questioned, power was examined. People asked not only what is true, but who decides? This question lingered, unanswered, and it would not remain harmless forever. The Renaissance had opened a door, but no one yet knew what would come through it. As awareness spread, so did ambition. People no longer accepted the world as fixed, they believed it could be shaped. Inventors imagined machines. Thinkers imagined systems. Explorers imagined new lands. And slowly, the idea of progress was born. The future was no longer fate. It was a destination. This belief changed everything. Work gained purpose beyond survival. Time gained value. Life gained direction. But with progress came imbalance. Those who moved faster surged ahead. Those who could not fell behind. The Renaissance had not promised equality. It had promised possibility. And possibility would soon demand a price. As centuries passed, people began to live inside the Renaissance's shadow. They built nations on its ideas. They argued wars with its logic. They justified power through its language. Reason became a weapon. Knowledge became influence. And still, few stopped to ask where it all began. The quiet art, the patient scholars, the thinkers who dared to question without knowing the outcome. The Renaissance had outgrown its origin. It was no longer a movement of artists, but a force shaping the modern world. And yet, its consequences were still unfolding. Well, even today, we live with its echo. Every question asked, every idea challenged, every belief examined. All trace back to that quiet awakening. But here is the lingering thought, the one that never fully rests. If one shift in thinking could reshape an entire continent, what might the next awakening change? The Renaissance was not an ending, it was a beginning, and beginnings never truly sleep.